The cabin lights had already shifted to the familiar glow that signaled arrival. The passengers around were gathering their belongings with the usual mixture of relief and hurry. Yet in the midst of the soft hum of the engines and the clatter of overhead bins, one man remained seated, unmoved and unwilling. His presence would soon turn an ordinary flight into a quiet battle of patience, authority, and dignity. Before starting, subscribe to our channel, then drop a comment of your experience. The plane had touched down smoothly on the tarmac of New York's busy airport, and for a moment it felt like any other landing. Passengers clapped softly. A few sighed with relief, and children who had grown restless during the long flight pressed their faces against the windows to see the lines of lights and airport vehicles. The crew moved quickly into their well-practiced routine, thanking passengers as they unbuckled their seatbelts, reminding them to check for their belongings, and preparing to escort everyone safely off the aircraft. There was no hint at that moment that anything unusual was about to happen, but stories often begin this way, quietly, without warning. Toward the front row sat a man who looked like he carried the weight of wealth with him, not just in the expensive cut of his suit or the gold watch that gleamed faintly in the dim cabin light, but in the aura of someone used to being obeyed. He was no stranger to the crew. They had served him before and knew his habits. He always expected more than what was offered, always assumed rules bent for his convenience. The other passengers barely noticed him because they were caught in their own rush to disembark. But the flight attendants saw him remain in his seat, his belt still fastened, his face calm but firm. "Sir, we have arrived. You may deplane now," said Maria, the lead flight attendant, her voice polite yet firm, in the way she had trained herself to be across thousands of flights. Her smile was steady, her tone respectful, but the man did not move. He looked at her for a long moment, then replied, "I am not getting off yet. I will leave when I decide." At first, Maria thought perhaps he was joking or simply tired. She tried again, reminding him that the cleaning crew would soon board, and that airport security protocols required everyone to leave the aircraft when it reached the gate. The man leaned back instead, adjusting his seat slightly as though to make himself more comfortable. Passengers continued filing out around him, dragging carry-ons and murmuring their goodbyes. Yet the billionaire sat still like a stone in a stream. The captain, who had stepped out to greet the passengers, noticed the situation. He raised a brow when Maria explained in a hushed tone, then approached the man directly, his voice deep, steady, authoritative. "Sir, we kindly ask that you disembark now. All passengers are required to leave the plane once it has parked." The billionaire looked at the captain as if weighing his words, then shook his head. "You do not understand. I am not like the others. I will not stand in that crowded line outside. I will leave when the terminal is empty." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had dealt with difficult passengers before, people who drank too much or argued about baggage rules. But this was different. This was defiance, pure and deliberate. The billionaire was not raising his voice or causing a scene, yet his refusal carried weight. It was quiet rebellion in a place where order was absolute. Minutes passed. The aircraft door remained open, but the flow of passengers slowed until only a handful remained. They looked curiously at the suited man who made no move to rise. One whispered to another, wondering aloud if he was sick. Another thought he was waiting for special transport. But when the last passenger left, the tension inside the cabin thickened. Silence settled, except for the faint beeping of ground equipment outside. Maria tried again, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "Sir, we cannot leave the gate until everyone has left the aircraft. Please cooperate." He turned his head and gave her a look that was not angry but dismissive. "You think you have authority over me because you wear that uniform, but I have more power than you realize. You cannot make me leave this seat until I choose." The crew gathered near the galley, debating what to do. The captain could not physically drag the man out, and the attendants knew confrontation could escalate badly. Security would have to be called if he continued to resist, but even that carried risk. A wealthy man like him could turn the narrative against them, accuse them of mistreatment, or file complaints with powerful contacts. Every choice felt heavy. Outside the jet bridge, workers waited. Their radios crackled with updates about cleaning and boarding schedules. The delay was beginning to ripple through the airport system. One stubborn passenger was enough to disturb The rhythm of hundreds of workers and travelers yet inside the cabin time seemed to stand still. Maria felt her pulse quicken as she approached once more. This time not as a uniformed attendant, but as a person trying to reach another person. "Sir, please understand this is not just a request. The airport has strict rules, and if we do not follow them, there will be consequences for everyone, including yourself. Let us help you leave comfortably. We can arrange privacy, if that is your concern." 4. The first time his expression shifted slightly, his eyes flickered with something softer, not quite guilt, but hesitation, as if her words touched a hidden reason beneath his stubbornness. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and leaned back still, refusing to move. At that moment, Maria realized this was not about luxury or arrogance alone. There was something deeper behind his refusal, something unspoken that had nothing to do with lines or crowds, but she could not yet name it. She only knew the situation had reached a breaking point, and the next decision would decide whether the story of this flight ended quietly or with headlines. The billionaire remained still in his seat, and the crew exchanged worried glances. Maria stepped back toward the galley where the others waited. Her hands trembling slightly from the weight of the moment, she whispered to the captain that the man simply would not leave. The captain sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. He had flown storms, handled engine malfunctions, and soothed panicked passengers. But this was a different kind of turbulence, one that tested patience and diplomacy more than skill. The cleaning crew was already waiting outside, growing impatient. The ground supervisor radioed in, asking why the cabin had not yet been cleared. Time was money at an airport, and every delay cascaded into the schedule of other flights. Still, the man sat there perfectly calm, as though the plane was his private lounge, his fingers tapping the armrest in slow rhythm, his gaze fixed ahead at nothing in particular. Maria decided she needed to change her approach. She walked back down the aisle, deliberately softening her tone as if speaking to a friend instead of a passenger. She told him that she understood crowds could be unpleasant, and that she could escort him out through a quieter exit if necessary. The billionaire looked at her, finally turning his eyes away from the front of the cabin, his voice lowered, now almost thoughtful. "Do you know why I do not want to leave?" he asked. She hesitated, shaking her head. He continued, "Because out there is chaos. I do not like to walk among them. I do not want to be stared at or touched or spoken to as if I am like everyone else in here. I have space in here. I have silence." Maria listened carefully. Part of her felt sympathy, yet another part burned with frustration. Everyone had to follow the same rules, and one person refusing risked the order of the entire operation. Still, his words revealed that it was not just arrogance but a fear of being ordinary, a fear of losing the invisible barrier between his world and the rest of humanity. The captain stepped in again, this time kneeling slightly so his gaze was level with the man. "Sir, this plane cannot remain open forever. Security will come soon. I am asking you man to please stand and leave with dignity before this turns into something bigger." His tone was steady, respectful, but firm. The billionaire's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened against the armrest. He said slowly, "Do you know what it feels like to be hunted every time you step outside? The flash of cameras, the whispers, the demands for photographs and attention you cannot understand because you are free. You live in anonymity. I live in a cage built of gold. I cannot even walk through a terminal without people staring. I will not go out there until it is empty." His confession filled the cabin like a heavy fog. The attendants glanced at each other, startled by his sudden honesty. His wealth had made him powerful, but it had also trapped him. His refusal to deplane was less about arrogance and more about reclaiming control in a world where even his footsteps were dictated by expectation. Maria felt a strange mix of pity and irritation. She wanted to tell him that all passengers, famous or unknown, shared the same air, breathed the same recycled oxygen, sat in the same cramped seats when the plane shook with turbulence. No money could steady it. But she held back. Instead, she tried again. "We can arrange an escort. We can clear a path for you the sooner you come. With us, the sooner you will have the privacy you want." The billionaire looked at her long and hard, then said, "And if I do not leave, will they drag me out?" His voice carried a challenge, a bitter edge that dared her to answer. Maria swallowed. She knew the answer was yes. Security could and would intervene, but saying it might push him deeper into resistance. As the silence stretched, the sound of footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. Security had been called, and 2 uniformed officers now stood outside the cabin waiting for instruction. The captain glanced at Maria, and she nodded reluctantly. The time for soft words was running out. One officer stepped in. Tall, broad-shouldered, his badge. Catching the glow of the cabin lights, he addressed the billionaire calmly. "Sir, we need you to stand and exit the aircraft now." The billionaire turned his head slowly, his face unreadable. "Do you even know who I am?" He asked. The officer did not blink. "Sir, it does not matter who you are. The rules are the same for everyone. Please come with us." For a long moment it seemed the man might refuse again, his hand clenched against the seat. His eyes narrowed. The crew held their breath, knowing the next words could decide whether this ended quietly or with chaos. Then suddenly he released a long sigh, leaned forward, and unbuckled his belt. The click echoed through the silent cabin. He stood at last, adjusting his jacket as if reclaiming his composure. But as he rose, he added a final remark, his voice cold. "Remember this, I may follow your rules now, but out there beyond these walls, the rules belong to me." He straightened his shoulders and walked slowly toward the exit, flanked by the officers. The crew watched him go, relief washing through them like cool air after a storm, yet none of them could shake the unease his words left behind. Maria exhaled deeply, pressing her hand to her chest, her pulse still racing. She knew the flight was over, but the story was far from finished. She had seen not just a wealthy man resisting rules, but a glimpse into the fragile cage of privilege and pride. And she wondered how many more untold battles like this played out behind the closed doors of airplanes. The cabin was finally empty, but the air inside still felt heavy. The hum of the engines had faded into silence, yet Maria and the rest of the crew lingered in the galley, their bodies tense, their eyes restless. The captain closed the cockpit door and joined them. He looked older than he had just a few hours earlier, his shoulders heavy from carrying the weight of authority. He said nothing at first, only rubbed his temples before speaking in a low voice. "We need to file a report. This will not end here." Maria nodded. She already knew the paperwork would be long. Every detail would have to be written, every word remembered. Because when someone of such influence was involved, airlines grew cautious. The story could leak to the press. The billionaire could file complaints or worse, twist the truth to paint himself as a victim and the crew as aggressors. It had happened before, and the damage could linger for months. She pulled out her small notebook, the one she always carried during flights, scribbling quick notes as the memory was still sharp. She wrote about the moment he refused, the tone of his voice, the way he leaned back as if rooted in the seat. She even wrote the exact words he had spoken about living in a golden cage. Each detail mattered because truth could be slippery when confronted with power. The rest of the attendants spoke quietly to each other, some still shaking their heads in disbelief. One whispered that she could not imagine having so much wealth and yet being so afraid of ordinary people. Another muttered that money seemed to twist a person into someone who forgot the simplest rules of decency. Yet Maria stayed silent. She could not deny she had felt something deeper in his words, something raw and human beneath the arrogance. Meanwhile, the billionaire walked through the terminal escorted by the officers, his polished shoes echoing against the tiled floor. A few passengers still lingering glanced curiously at him. Some recognized his face, whispering his name to one another, but no one approached the officers, formed a protective wall around him. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a prisoner being marched through unfamiliar territory. Outside the terminal, his private car waited, a sleek black vehicle with tinted windows. His driver jumped out, opening the door with a quick bow. The billionaire slid inside without a word. The door shut and the car pulled away, disappearing. Into the night, the officers exchanged glances. One shook his head, muttering that some people truly believed they lived above everyone else. The other officer shrugged, saying quietly that perhaps being so visible to the world was its own punishment. Back inside the airport, the airline supervisor demanded answers. The captain explained the situation calmly but firmly emphasizing that the man had not been violent, only resistant. Still, the delay had caused disruption to cleaning schedules connecting flights and gate assignments. The supervisor scribbled notes, his eyes hard. He warned the crew that the billionaire would almost certainly lodge a complaint and that they should be ready to defend themselves. Maria tried to steady her breathing as she walked out of the terminal. Her shift finally done yet. The weight of the night clung to her like a shadow. She thought about the billionaire alone in his luxury car surrounded by comfort, yet so unwilling to step among ordinary travelers. She wondered if wealth could truly shield someone from the world or if it only built higher walls around them, trapping them in their own fears. At home, she could not sleep. She sat by the window staring at the quiet street below, her pen in hand. She opened her notebook again, writing not just the facts but her feelings. She wrote about the way he stared at her as if testing her resolve, the way his voice cracked ever so slightly when he spoke about being hunted. She wrote about her own anger, about her desire to tell him that no amount of gold could change the laws of gravity. When a plane dipped in turbulence, she even wrote about the brief flicker of pity she had felt. The words poured out of her, filling page after page until dawn began to break, painting the sky with faint streaks of pink. She closed the notebook and leaned back, exhausted but calmer. The act of writing had eased the pressure inside her chest. She knew she would have to hand in an official report to the airline, but this private record was hers alone, a way to remember not just the incident but the emotions that came with it. Across the city, the billionaire sat in his penthouse apartment high above the streets. The city stretched below him like a living, map lights blinking in endless grids. He sat in silence, a glass of expensive whiskey untouched at his side, his thoughts circling restlessly. He replayed the scene on the plane, the look in the flight attendant's eyes, the way she had spoken, not with fear but with quiet firmness. It had unsettled him in a way few things did. He had expected resistance but not compassion, not an attempt to understand him. He thought of her words about privacy being arranged, and for a moment he had almost agreed, almost let go of the control he clung to, but pride had stopped him. Pride and the gnawing fear that stepping out too soon would make him appear weak in front of strangers. He hated weakness above all things. He had built his life on power, on never bending to others, but tonight, for the first time in years, he wondered if that strength had become a chain instead of armor. The glass of whiskey remained untouched as he rose and walked to the wide window, his reflection staring back at him against the glittering skyline. He whispered to himself words no one else could hear. Am I free or am I trapped? His voice cracked with the weight of the question, but the silence of the penthouse offered no answer, only the echo of his own doubts. The following morning, the airline headquarters buzzed with activity. The incident had already reached the ears of senior management, not because of a formal complaint, but because whispers had traveled fast across staff networks. Airports were like living organisms. News spread through them like electricity. Maria and the crew were summoned to a meeting room. Pale walls, a long table, and a manager whose expression revealed nothing. She asked them to recount the event step by step, every action, every word spoken. Maria sat upright, her hands folded on the table, her voice steady as she explained how the man refused, how they tried with patience, how security eventually had to intervene. The captain added his account, calm and precise, like the log entries he wrote after every flight. Another attendant described the unease, the silence, the way passengers glanced back as they walked out of the cabin, sensing something unusual in the air. The manager nodded slowly, jotting notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. Then she said something that chilled Maria more than the memory of the night itself. The billionaire was known to the airline. He had flown often with them, and he had influence. Their reports needed to be exact without exaggeration, because a single misstep could be turned against them in court or in the press. When the meeting ended, Maria walked out with the others, but her mind stayed trapped in that cabin, replaying the man's refusal again and again. She could still hear his words about living in a cage of gold. She had not told the manager about that. She had kept it to herself, perhaps because it sounded less like a fact and more like a confession. She wanted to hold on to it, not for official record, but for her own memory. Meanwhile, the billionaire moved through his day as if nothing had happened. His assistants brought him documents to sign. His phone buzzed with calls from investors and associates. His calendar was full, Yet in every quiet moment between tasks, he felt the ghost of last night clinging to him. He had not expected to feel shaken by the encounter. But he was. He found himself distracted, glancing out of windows as if the world outside was suddenly closer, more real than before. By late afternoon, he called his personal aide, a young man who had been with him for years, loyal and efficient. He asked him bluntly what people were saying about the flight. The aide hesitated, then admitted that some gossip had spread on social media. A few passengers had hinted online about a delay caused by a stubborn wealthy traveler. Though they had not named him directly, the billionaire clenched his jaw. He hated rumors almost as much as he hated being told what to do. He ordered his aide to monitor the chatter to make sure it did not grow into something larger. Then he dismissed him, pacing the floor of his office, his mind circling like a restless animal. He kept seeing the face of the flight attendant, Maria. Though he did not know her name, he remembered her calm voice, her eyes that did not flinch when he tested her patience. He found himself wondering why she had spoken to him that way, not as if he were untouchable, but as if he were human. That night, he dined alone in his vast apartment. The city lights glittering outside his windows, yet the food on his plate had no taste. He set down his fork. Untouched frustration gnawed at him. He wanted to dismiss the memory of the flight as a minor inconvenience, but it refused. To leave his thoughts again and again, he replayed the sound of the captain's voice, the firmness of the officer's command, the quiet plea of the attendant he had faced storms in boardrooms, fought battles in courts, conquered competitors, yet this small moment on an airplane unsettled him more than all of them combined. On the other side of the city, Maria returned to duty within 2 days. Another flight, another set of passengers, another routine. Yet as she walked down the aisle, greeting travelers, her mind drifted. She wondered if the billionaire was flying again, if he was somewhere in the air on another plane, testing the patience of another crew. She hoped not. She hoped that perhaps their encounter had shaken him too. Though she doubted it, people like him rarely changed. But she was wrong. He had changed, if only slightly. He found himself questioning small things, noticing how people looked at him in public, wondering whether their stares were admiration, envy, or judgment. Wore his wealth like armor, but suddenly it felt thin, almost transparent. He began traveling with heavier security, demanding private lounges even for domestic flights. He thought it would protect him, but instead it deepened his unease. Late one evening, as he sat in his study, the city muted by the thick glass windows, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was of him as a young man, before the money, before the fame. Standing in an airport holding a small suitcase, his clothes modest, his face tired but free. He stared at the photo for a long time, a strange ache rising in his chest. He whispered to the empty room, "When did I become afraid of being just another passenger?" The words hung in the silence, echoing in his mind. Closed the drawer sharply as if to hide the memory, but the question lingered, refusing to disappear. Weeks passed yet. The night on the airplane lingered in quiet corners of both their lives. Maria carried on with her flights, moving from one city to another, her days filled with passengers' luggage and safety checks. Outwardly nothing had changed, but every so often she thought back to that moment when the billionaire refused to move. She remembered the stillness in the cabin, the way her heart had raced as she spoke calmly to him, and how the whole plane seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. For the billionaire, the memory had sharpened instead of fading. He thought about it during meetings when his advisors spoke about markets and investments. He thought about it at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. And he thought about it whenever he traveled again, though he demanded complete privacy and first-class treatment. He could not shake the ghost of that evening. Sometimes he wondered if people recognized him as the man from that incident, even if no one had said so to his face. His assistant finally gathered courage one day and told him the truth. A blog had picked up the story, someone had leaked details, though his name was never revealed. The description was clear enough to those who knew him. It spoke about a billionaire who refused to leave a plane, causing delay and drawing the quiet frustration of an entire crew. The aide said carefully, "Sir, people are starting to guess." He stared at him with cold eyes. But deep down, he felt the stab of reality. He could not control everything. Not the markets, not the whispers, not even his own image anymore. Maria read that same blog on her phone one morning before a flight. She sipped coffee in the break room, eyes scanning the words. Her heart tightened. She never expected the story to leak beyond airline walls. She wondered who had spoken out, and she wondered if the man himself had seen it. She folded the phone away and focused on her day. Yet throughout her shift, the thought stayed with her. The world now knew a piece of the truth. The billionaire decided to confront it in his own way. He called a press contact and arranged for an interview, one that would present him in a sympathetic light. He rehearsed carefully how he would spin the event, perhaps describing it as exhaustion or a misunderstanding. He wanted to shape the narrative. But when the cameras finally rolled, something unexpected happened. The journalist asked him bluntly why he had refused to leave the plane, and for a moment, he froze. He saw Maria's face in his mind, her calm eyes, her voice reminding him that wealth did not erase rules. He answered slowly, saying he felt tired that night and unwell, and perhaps he had not communicated clearly, but as the words left his mouth, he felt hollow because he knew the truth was different. He had refused out of pride, out of the stubborn belief that he was above the rules, and though no one around him saw it, he felt ashamed of the lie. The interview ended with polite smiles and crafted phrases, but when he returned to his apartment, he threw off his jacket in frustration, staring out at the city as if it could give him answers. Meanwhile, Maria's life intersected with the story again, weeks later when she was assigned to another flight, a quiet route across the country. As she prepared for boarding, she saw him walking down the jet bridge alone, this time without assistance, without guards. He wore a simple jacket, not the tailored suits he was known for. Her breath caught. She never imagined she would see him again. He looked different, quieter. His shoulders less rigid, his eyes carrying a weight that had not been there before. He recognized her instantly, and for a brief second their eyes met. Neither spoke, but in that silence something passed between them. A recognition of the night they shared, an understanding that did not need words. He gave a faint nod before moving to his seat. Maria continued her duties as if nothing unusual had happened yet. Her heart beat faster with every step down the aisle. Throughout the flight he remained calm, reading a book, sipping water, not demanding anything, not even attention. He seemed almost invisible compared to the man who once refused to leave a plane. She noticed the difference and wondered if their confrontation months ago had played a part in it, but she did not dwell on it too long. Her job required focus and composure, and she had mastered both over years of flying. When the plane landed and passengers filed out, he paused near the exit, waiting for the line to thin. Then as he stepped forward, he spoke softly, almost to himself, but just loud enough for her to hear. "Thank you for that night." His eyes held hers for a heartbeat longer before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Maria stood frozen by the door, his words echoing inside her. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she knew it mattered to him, perhaps more than he would ever admit. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, then straightened her uniform and prepared for the next set of passengers. Her life, like the flight, always moving forward. After that unexpected encounter, Maria returned to her routine, but something inside her shifted. She realized that moments in the air could ripple far beyond the walls of a cabin. They could change people in ways unseen. She had always believed her job was about safety, efficiency, and kindness. But now she understood it was also about leaving impressions that could stay with passengers long after landing. The billionaire's quiet words haunted her, not in a painful way, but in a way that made her wonder how fragile even the strongest-looking lives could be. For the billionaire, those words had not come easily. He replayed them in his mind later that night, sitting in silence by his large window overlooking the skyline. He thought about how strange it felt to thank someone who had once stood against him, but gratitude had pressed itself out of him like an unstoppable tide. He realized that Maria had given him something no wealth or power could. She had reminded him of boundaries, of humility, of the reality that rules were not chains but equalizers. He began noticing changes in himself. He canceled a few public appearances. He traveled less. He spent more time alone, away from the circles of people who constantly praised or feared him. He started revisiting old journals, scribbled thoughts from his youth when money was still a dream and not yet a burden. He found entries about airports, the thrill of travel, the freedom of being no one special. He read them with a mix of nostalgia and sorrow, as if they belonged to another man, one he had lost along the way. Meanwhile, Maria shared the memory of the encounter with no one. It became a secret chapter in her long career, something personal she carried like a hidden jewel. On her lonelier nights, she thought about how strange it was to be remembered by someone so untouchable. Yet she felt no pride, only a quiet acknowledgement that even billionaires could break under the weight of their own crowns. The world outside continued spinning. His name still appeared in headlines for business moves, acquisitions, and donations, but behind the polished image he felt a growing restlessness. The skyscrapers and limousines began to look less like trophies and more like cages. His aides noticed his change: fewer orders, more silence, fewer outbursts, more reflection. Sometimes he would stand by the office window, staring at the airport in the distance, watching planes lift into the sky and vanish into clouds. One afternoon, he surprised his staff by asking to book a commercial flight without the usual privileges. No private lounges, no heavy entourage, just a seat among others. His aides exchanged nervous glances, thinking he was joking, but he insisted, and within days, it was arranged. The flight was short, domestic, simple, but for him it carried the weight of a lifetime. He walked into the terminal alone, passing families with luggage, children running, couples arguing about gates. He felt invisible and strangely alive. Sitting in his seat, he looked around at strangers, reading, sleeping, scrolling through phones. For once, he was not the center of attention. He was just another passenger. The hum of the engines soothed him. The safety announcements played with their familiar rhythm, and he realized he had not truly listened to them in years. He watched the crew move through the cabin, efficient and calm, and thought about Maria again, wondering if she was in the air somewhere, repeating the same words with the same steady voice. When the flight landed, he felt a lightness in his chest, a freedom he had not tasted in years. He carried his own small bag down the jet bridge, blending into the crowd for the first time in decades. No one stopped him. No one asked for anything. He was simply part of the flow, and that anonymity felt like a gift. That night in his home, he made a quiet decision. He would not abandon his empire, but he would no longer let it blind him to the smallness of human experiences. He began keeping a notebook, writing down observations about ordinary people in airports, in planes, and waiting lines. He found beauty in things he had once dismissed: a tired mother soothing a crying baby, a nervous student clutching documents, a weary pilot greeting his crew. He wrote them all down as if capturing stories untold, and through it all, Maria's presence lingered like an unseen compass, guiding him toward humility. Though they never spoke again, he carried her in his memory as the woman who had stood her ground and unknowingly opened a crack in the walls he had built around himself. The billionaire's world changed slowly but steadily, and he hardly noticed it at first. He attended fewer parties. He avoided the endless parade of shallow conversations that once filled his nights. He turned down invitations from people who only wanted to orbit his wealth, and instead he found himself wandering through airports just to sit and watch flights come and go. The same places that once felt like inconveniences now felt like doorways to something he had forgotten. One evening, he sat at a small cafe tucked between two gates, a paper cup of coffee in his hands, watching travelers rush past, and for the first time in years, he felt ordinary. He saw a family hugging tightly before a father boarded a flight, tears in their eyes. He saw a young woman staring nervously at her boarding pass, rehearsing words under her breath for what might be a job interview. He saw an old man reading a letter with trembling fingers, smiling faintly as if it carried news he had waited a lifetime for. He scribbled notes into his journal, capturing each detail, not as a businessman but as a human observer. He realized airports were filled with stories that wealth could never buy, each person carrying a private world of hope, fear, love, and regret. And he thought about how many of those stories went unnoticed by people like him, who moved through life shielded by privilege. Maria, meanwhile, lived her life high above the clouds, moving from one flight to another. She never heard from the billionaire again, but sometimes she sensed his shadow in the news or in the silence of her own thoughts. She wondered if he had forgotten her, or if he carried the same memory that she did. She did not dwell on it too much. Her duty was to care for the hundreds of passengers who placed their trust in her every day. Yet deep down she knew some encounters left marks that no amount of time could erase. Months passed until one day fate brushed their paths again, though neither expected it. Maria boarded a long haul flight preparing for the usual routine safety checks, calm smiles, reassurance for nervous travelers as she moved through the cabin. She froze. He was there, seated quietly in the middle of the section, not surrounded by guards or assistants, just a man with a book in his hand. His eyes lifted, meeting hers, and for a moment the air thickened between them. This time he smiled faintly. A genuine smile, not the polished mask of a man used to being photographed. She felt a warmth she could not explain, and gave a polite nod before moving on. He did not demand anything throughout the flight. He did not even press the call button once, when she passed by offering drinks. He thanked her softly like any other passenger, and she noticed how other travelers barely looked at him because to them he was no one special, and perhaps that was exactly how he wanted it. After the flight landed, he waited until most passengers had gone, then paused at the door looking at her one last time. He said, "You probably saved me more than you realize." She looked at him puzzled, but before she could reply he stepped out, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her with those words echoing like a riddle. In the following weeks he continued to fly, not frequently, but enough to remind himself of what it meant to be among people without titles or walls. Each flight became a lesson. Each stranger beside him, a mirror of humanity he had overlooked for so long. Sometimes he shared small conversations with fellow travelers, about weather, about destinations, about nothing important but everything meaningful. He cherished those moments because they grounded him in ways billions never had. Maria never told anyone about these encounters. They belonged only to her, like quiet secrets between the sky and the earth. She stored them away in her heart, certain that even if their lives moved in different directions forever, they had both been changed by that single night, when he refused to deplane, and she refused to surrender. Years passed, and the memory of that fateful night became less a wound and more a turning point etched quietly into both their lives. Maria grew older in the skies, her hair carrying silver strands, her steps slower, but her voice as steady as ever. She trained younger attendants, now reminding them that kindness and firmness were not opposites but partners. She never mentioned the billionaire by name, but sometimes when she taught about difficult passengers, she thought of him and how one act of standing firm had echoed far beyond a single flight. The billionaire too aged with time, his empire remained vast, but he no longer chased headlines with the same hunger he kept to himself, more often writing in his journals, reflecting on life, rather than competing in endless battles for power. His fortune still surrounded him, but he wore it differently, like a coat he could take off rather than armor, welded to his skin. He traveled less yet. Whenever he did, he chose commercial flights, sitting among ordinary people, observing their world, scribbling their silent stories as if each one held more value than his portfolio. There were rumors among his circles that he had grown eccentric, that he had lost his edge, that he no longer cared about the ruthless games of business, but he let them speak. He had learned long ago that silence often carried more strength than argument. Sometimes he would smile to himself, remembering how once he thought being forced off a plane was humiliation. But now he saw it as the first time in decades he had truly been seen not as a billionaire but as a man. One spring afternoon he sat by a window in a small airport lounge, not private, not extravagant, just a simple place where sunlight spilled across the floor. He opened his notebook and began to write a line that had been circling his thoughts for weeks. Every flight is a story, and every story is a reminder that we are all passengers for a moment. He paused, staring at the words before underlining them. Slowly he realized it was the closest thing to truth he had ever written. Maria retired a few years later, her final flight filled with tears, applause, and flowers from colleagues. She accepted the praise humbly, but inside she thought about the journeys that had shaped her most of all. And that night with the billionaire remained among them, not for the drama, not for the tension, but because it revealed something she had always believed deep down. No matter how high people rose or how much they owned, in the end the skies made everyone equal. Her last day she walked through the airport one final time, her uniform crisp, her badge gleaming. She passed strangers rushing to gates, parents comforting children, travelers lost in their own Thoughts. She smiled quietly, knowing she had been part of countless stories she would never hear. She felt peace knowing that her chapter in the skies was closing with dignity and grace. The billionaire never knew of her retirement, though he sometimes thought of her wondering if she was still out there moving down aisles with calm authority. Sometimes he caught himself scanning the faces of attendants, half expecting to see her again, but she never appeared still. He carried her voice in his memory, not as a haunting but as a guiding echo. Years later, when his health began to fail, he found himself on one last flight. Not in a private jet, but in a simple cabin with a window seat. The engines roared and the plane lifted into the clouds. He looked out at the endless horizon, feeling the weight of his years and the lightness of being just another soul in the sky. He whispered softly to himself, almost like a prayer, "Thank you." Far away, Maria sat in her home by the window watching planes streak across the evening sky, her heart calm, her spirit content. She did not know that at the same moment a man once feared and admired was whispering gratitude into the same clouds. But perhaps some truths needed no audience. They lived quietly between people who once crossed paths and changed each other without ever meaning to. And so the story ended not with headlines, not with wealth, not with applause, but with two lives touched in the fleeting space of an airplane cabin, a reminder that no matter how high we climb, we all walk through the same gates, sit in the same seats, and share the same fragile skies for a little while.